have specific examples coming from the other speakers. But
our next speaker is Dr. Axel Timpe from Germany. He's also, of course, he's a researcher, but he's also one of the contributors to the Cost Action Urban Agriculture Europe. He will tell a bit more about these European networks and bringing some of the key successes across Europe. Of course, some would be of interest also to the ACP countries, but because it's a booming, as it was said, a booming activity, especially in Europe, it was really interesting to see the best practices. You will also focus on green infrastructure, as it was said by Henk. The conversion of some of the urban spaces, historic places, and so on is very interesting. Is also something that Richard will touch in the UK and in London. So please, Dr. Timpe. And while you sit here, I would like to say also what Henk told you as resources. All of those were already included in the reader that you have in the folder. But please, if there are any missing or any from you organizations you want we include, we will have a revised version afterwards. So we will be more than happy to include more resources, networks, and so on to share. Thank you very much, Dr. Timpe.
Thank you, Isolina. Yes, it started. So, as you said, I'm a researcher and landscape architect at RWTH Aachen University in Germany, and I've been working on urban agriculture as a researcher, but also in practice as a landscape architect. And I'm going to present today the main results of the research that we have conducted in Cost Action Urban Agriculture Europe. COST is a cooperation in science and technology, actually the longest running science cooperation instrument of the EU, and in my parallel research on productive parks, which I did as a PhD. So the cost action that we were running from 2012 to 2016 brought together European researchers, but also practitioners from cities and from agronomy and farming from 25 European countries. And what we were looking at was not vertical visions of urban farming that might be a future promise for feeding the cities. What we looked at was what is actually happening on the ground in bottom-up innovation in the 25 European countries which were participating, which you see here on the map, not only EU countries, also some associated countries to which this instrument is open, and where we conducted with researchers who are very close to the ground a lot of case studies and collected experiences from what people are doing in traditional farming in urban and peri-urban areas, but also in innovative farming concerning business models. We published it in a book with the classical chapters, the phenomenon urban agriculture, which typology of it can we find in Europe, how is the governance of urban agriculture dealt with by cities and also by self-organized communities, what are business models of urban agriculture that we have, what is the spatial dimension, mainly dealing with green infrastructure, and what is the metabolism. So Henk already mentioned the food, water, energy nexus, and urban agriculture can play a role here. And we set, together with stakeholders from the European Commission, DG Agri, a future agenda for urban agriculture, which would be possible in Europe, also by the common agrarian policy that is set up by the EU. And we had seven case study regions with an in-depth study that we present in the book. But what I want to present today, because you asked me to which are the successes of urban agricultures, is what we learned about the three questions: which urban agriculture is successful in Europe, where is urban agriculture successful on which land, and how is urban agriculture successful. So for Europe, and I'm an expert on Europe. I'm not an expert on other parts of the world concerning urban agriculture. We can say for the question which urban agriculture is successful, that it is an urban agriculture which is always more than food production, which involves the people, the professional and non-professional people dealing with agriculture, and because even in Europe, where cities are not growing as fast as in other parts of the world, we still have pressure on the agricultural land. So if farmers and agricultural initiatives want to stay in place, they have to find other functions for them which are added values to food production, which is often marginalized. So we could set up a typology across the 25 participating countries of urban agriculture with the urban food gardening level, where we have individual production in allotment gardens or family gardens, but where we have more and more types of collective production also, where initiatives which have an additional motivation than food production, set up educational gardens, set up therapeutical gardens, or new kinds of allotment and community gardens. But we also have the urban farming level, where professional farmers do urban agriculture in urban and peri-urban spaces, where they propose, for example, on-site experiences on the land and on their farm where they produce food, where they propose leisure services. The typology where we have the professional farmers on the lower part of the slide, who produce other services than just food, who produce social services, therapeutical services, but of course we also have local food farms or farms that produce food but are paid sometimes also by the state, by the cities, for providing environmental services or by caring for cultural heritage, which we find in many urban regions, because there have been specific forms of urban farming in these areas, which are today a cultural heritage which can only be conserved if the farming continues. The second question, and there I would really like to show the maps, is where is urban agriculture successful? And Henk mentioned the importance of urban and spatial planning for it, and urban agriculture in Europe can be successful where it allies itself with urban planning and where it provides green infrastructure and public open spaces for the urban dwellers, where it gets accepted in the urban planning as an important land use because it can provide multifunctional services to the city. The key word for this in Europe is green infrastructure, which is a main strategy of the European Union. You see its definition on the next slide. Green infrastructure is a strategically planned network of natural and semi-natural areas with environmental features designed and managed to deliver a wide range of ecosystem services. And the slide that follows, it shows all the elements that are a part of the green infrastructure in the city according to the European definition, and it's multifunctional farming, which is just one component, but which is a component that is central in the green systems of many European cities. And the next slides will show that many cities invented a tool in spatial planning, which is the productive or the agricultural park. I detected 37 parks of this kind in the PhD study, where land use planning has been set up that integrates urban agricultural land to the green system. You see on the next slide that this land or these parks are of a very different size. Some of them are just 10 hectares and have nevertheless strategic positions. Some range to more than 1,000 hectares of agricultural land in the city. If you look at slide 17, which is the town I currently live in, Aachen, I think you have grayscale maps. Now we see the map on the screen. Aachen, the city where I currently live in, which has a system of green fingers coming into the city from the periphery, and the largest green finger actually is an area used by urban agriculture. On the next slide you will see this green finger system, which is important. In a city on the next slide, Cologne, the fourth biggest city in Germany, you have a green system of green rings, the inner one and the outer green belt, which is traditionally parkland, but which also contains two agricultural parks, with actually do the articulation between the city's green belt and the green corridors that go into the urban region. On the next slide you will see them a little bit more easily. And the city, of course, would like to have green areas and parks everywhere, but in today's situation of public finance, they cannot afford any longer to turn everything which is green infrastructure into parks. They need people which care for it, and these in some areas are the farmers, because if the farmers work on their land, if they care for their land, they also sustain the green infrastructure and ecosystem services that we find there. A next example is Geneva, where we also have a green corridor system, but a small productive park of 10 hectares within the rectangle, which makes the link between some or two of the main green corridors. The next slide, only with the green system. Paris, one of the most dense urban areas in Europe, where we only have patches of green infrastructure, but where one new patch on the next slide, visible and also in images later, is an agricultural area, the Parc des Lilas, where new forms of urban agriculture sustain this land use and invite the public. What do these parks look like? In Cologne, it's an example of co-design where the city and the farmers met, and they invite people to come to this area by new ways for walking, cycling, roller skating in this park, where they created vistas on the city in the background with the Cologne Cathedral, from which people can experience agriculture, so that they not consider it as a marginal activity somewhere on the fringe of the city, but as an area which has an aesthetic and recreational value for them. And in some other examples, farmers really co-produce these parks. In the Ruhr metropolis, the landscape park Mechtenberg, where we have some kind of ornamental farming that creates special landscape images, but on the next slide also a kind of farming where the farmers invite people to come on their land by proposing self-harvesting fields or gardens. If you can go one back, the system is the farmer prepares the field in spring, as you can see on the left two images, and then during summer people can rent a small lot from him to come and to water, to weed and to harvest their own food for people who live in the cities and who don't have access to their own land. So the farmer with his knowledge and his technology generates additional income. The photo shows a little bit what these areas look like, and they are as much also a meeting place between farmers and urban citizens as they are a field of production. And the last example, which I show with photos, is the Parc des Lilas in Paris, which is in some parts of it a classic park, a classic green space with a large alley, but which is also an area where agricultural techniques are used to manage the green spaces. On the next slide. And have food production on the same time. On the next slide we see that there are some professional gardeners on the left side which produce ornamental plants directly in the heart of the park where we have the big alley. And on the next slide of this park we see that the park also offers space for gardening communities which started organic food farming inside the park, which have their own area where they produce, but where we find large public spaces for people who can walk around and maybe get interested in participating in these communities. And the last question in the presentation is, how is urban agriculture successful? How can the farmers fight against being marginalized? It is by creating innovative business models which go beyond the classic agrarian markets, which are a different kind or an additional service to food production. We, on the next slide, on this slide, have with 130 interviews with urban farmers in Europe identified 5 business models that some of them have in common. On the left side you see business models which you can apply more or less everywhere in agriculture. Differentiation through having different products from other farmers. Diversification by proposing more products and by having different branches in one agricultural enterprise, and low cost, of course, by producing high amounts at reduced costs. But on the right side, you have 2 business models that are really specific to urban agriculture in Europe. One, we named it the Commons, where farmers in the peri-urban and the urban area open up their farms and make people come to work with them and actually to create a community around food production which can have additional benefits like the social cohesion and so on. And the last one on the lower right is the experience model, where the farmers sell their product, but they sell also the experience to people to work on the farm, to be with them, to see how a chicken is raised, to see how a chicken is slaughtered, or maybe to doing it themselves, because in Europe many people feel disconnected from these processes, and urban farming has business models that use their search for these experiences. And I will not go into detail. The next slide shows the so-called business model canvases, which explain a little more in our book how do these activities work, which is the cost structure, the revenue streams, which is the key value proposition in the center, the customer segments, and the key partnerships. So I hope that I have given an impression on the 3 questions in this presentation, and I can finish with the message that urban agriculture research will continue in Europe. We are currently launching a Horizon 2020 innovation action on nature-based solutions in marginalized urban areas with 3 frontrunner cities: Dortmund in Germany, Zagreb in Croatia, and Turin in Italy. where we will put to a test, for example, a community-operated aquaponics system in Dortmund, where we will try to create new soils for urban agriculture with urban wastes in Turin, and where in all 3 cities we will have urban gardening projects for social inclusion, and where we will try to measure the effects of these so-called nature-based solutions. And on the last slide, the urban agricultural heritage and its way to inform the shaping of future cities would also be the subject of a conference that we will do in 1 year in Hanover, Herrenhausen, that time with a global vision with partners also from Cuba and from Japan, because when we want to make urban agriculture useful for future cities, we maybe need high technology innovations, but we also need low-tech experiences which we can find in traditional practices, and we will have a look at this.
Thank you very much.